I do apologize for the typo in the litany. I think there probably is a theological difference between reviving our souls and revising our souls. I do a whole lot more revising in my work than reviving, so. Our gospel lesson for this morning comes from the second chapter of the Gospel of John. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I think I should give just a little bit of a trigger warning for my sermon for today, if you know what those are, because our gospel lesson is about wine, and so is the sermon. I know that many people struggle to remain sober or bear scars from living with alcoholic family members. Alcoholism is a terrible disease. And like many Protestant churches, we here at Home Church use grape juice instead of wine in Holy Communion, so we do not exclude anyone who shouldn't drink alcohol or chooses to abstain. Our gospel lesson presents a positive picture of wine, and we will see as we go through the sermon, this is because wine had not just simply practical value in the ancient world, but great symbolic value. I may need to give a second trigger warning as well, because our text for today is about a wedding. And I know weddings can generate a lot of anxiety for people, especially, since I had 4 daughters. I'm familiar with this. Don't worry though, our lesson is not about bridezilla or epic wedding fails, I promise you. Our lesson comes to us from the Gospel of John, which is a fascinating book. Over half of the Gospel, starting at chapter 13, deals just with the last day of Jesus' life and then his resurrection. The first half of the book covers the other 3 years of Jesus' life and ministry, beginning with John the Baptist and then Jesus calling his disciples. In those 12 chapters, Jesus performs just 7 miracles, far fewer than any of the other Gospels. Actually, John doesn't even use the word miracle for these events. He says that Jesus performed 7 signs that revealed his glory. So, Jesus turns water into wine, heals an official's son, heals a lame man, feeds the 5,000 in the wilderness, walks on water, heals a blind man, and raises someone from the dead. Most of these signs have parallel stories in other Gospels. The details change, but they're similar ideas. In John, they always have more symbolic value and interpretation. It is interesting, at least to me, that the only miracle that is unique in the Gospel of John is the first one, turning water into wine. And I know it's easy to dismiss this as a trivial miracle, especially when compared to something dramatic like walking on water or raising Lazarus from the dead. And it's possible that the other gospel writers didn't think it was worth talking about at all. After all, humans have been turning water into wine for thousands of years, just not instantaneously. But John did not consider the miracle trivial at all. It was the first of 7 significant things that demonstrated who Jesus was. And there's several interesting things in this passage that are easy to overlook, especially if you're only concerned about whether drinking red wine is healthy for your heart or not. Before we examine this passage in detail, let me dismiss one idea that originated during the temperance movement in America. People sometimes say that the wine Jesus made was not fermented since it was new wine. I've even read older Moravian documents that recommend using, quote, unfermented wine for Holy Communion, which is, of course, simply grape juice. I don't know much about wine. I do like a good Pinot. And I do know that there is no such thing as unfermented wine. It would be like describing a grape as an undried raisin. I'm also pretty sure that in the history of civilization, no master at a banquet has ever praised someone for bringing out the good grape juice. The text says wine, and in fact, a very fine wine. The Gospel of John, though, is a gospel of symbolism and metaphor. Wine in the Old Testament is a symbol of divine abundance and blessing. The Promised Land was covered with vineyards, with large clusters of grapes to bring much juice for wine. In Jewish thought, Israel was the bride and God was the bridegroom. And the Messianic age was the celebration of a wedding feast. Wine is a symbol of spiritual abundance and God's love. John's story of the wedding of Cana is not just a miracle story about transforming one thing into another. It is a revelation as Jesus as the promised Messiah, the one who will bring in the joyous kingdom of God. Now, to get into it, let me set the scene for you. Weddings were a big deal in ancient times. Now, I know that weddings can be a big deal in modern America. I have presided at a lot of weddings. I've been to weddings that cost more than my annual salary when I was a young professor. And I've read about weddings that cost more than my house. We have a huge industry devoted to weddings, and some people plan weddings for years. But I think the big thing that makes modern weddings different from the ancient ones is that today weddings tend to be a very personal, individual statement. Couples want something that distinguishes them, wedding themes and so forth. There's a bit of showing off in a wedding. But in the ancient world, weddings were big things, but they weren't actually that much about the bride and groom. They were primarily about the extended family. Marriages would have been arranged by fathers, and the wedding ceremony celebrated the union of 2 families. And everyone in the community was invited to them. In Jewish texts from the time of Jesus, it appears that most Jewish weddings lasted 7 days. They would begin on a Wednesday and go through the Sabbath and the next week. 7 is the number of perfection and creation. Preparations took months, and some people traveled for weeks to arrive at the wedding. Invitations did not have a +1. Whole families were invited, children, grandparents, and everyone. And guests often contributed to the festivities by bringing wine to enjoy. So, in our lesson for today, John tells us that Jesus and his disciples were invited to a wedding in the town of Cana. For centuries, people have speculated over whose wedding it was, But the truth is, we don't know who was getting married. That's not the focus of the story. The novelist Dan Brown several years ago claimed it was Jesus getting married, but that's ridiculous since Jesus was invited to the wedding and the groom doesn't get invited to his own wedding. It is more likely that either the bride or groom was related to Jesus and his family. We are told that Mary was there, and she was rather important since servants obey her orders. There's no mention of Joseph, which may indicate she was a widow. These details are interesting, but we should not miss the main significance of the fact that Jesus went to a wedding with his disciples at the very beginning of his ministry. He didn't go because he was forced to by his mother. He went and brought his companions with him. This is especially surprising since we know some of those first disciples had been disciples of John the Baptist, who was famous for never drinking wine and living in the wilderness and did not join in celebrations. So it's quite likely that Jesus was intentionally teaching his followers that his way was different from the Baptist. Many Christians through the centuries have thought that they should live the way John the Baptist did, denying the flesh and abstaining from wine and other things. Some went so far as to live in caves in the desert. They believed the way to please God was to renounce earthly pleasure and withdraw from society. This is so common that religion scholars have a term for it: asceticism. People in other religions have also found asceticism helpful in their spirituality. During Lent, many ordinary Christians adopt asceticism, giving up something they enjoy. The first generation of Moravians were ascetic and lived in voluntary poverty, refused to live in cities which had too many tempting pleasures. At one time in the early Moravian church, there was a debate over whether it is sinful to enjoy drinking a cup of cold water when you're thirsty. It may sound silly to us, but if you define sin or pleasure as sinful, then it makes sense. But then some of the younger Moravians who were studying the New Testament pointed out that Jesus not only went to a wedding, he provided the wine. How could the church say it's sinful to hold celebrations and occasionally enjoy yourself and laugh with your friends? They also noticed most of Paul's letters were addressed to people in cities, so there's nothing wrong with being urban. So eventually the Moravian church changed its teachings and continues to teach self-control and discipline while also encouraging celebrations on occasion. So Jesus did not withdraw from society or live in isolation. John's gospel teaches us that Christians should live in the world while not being worldly. Even though Jesus was not married, he did not insist that celibacy is a higher ideal or condemn those who get married. Jesus was blessing marriage as a holy estate, as the Catholic Church teaches, and we say in our marriage ceremony, but more so, I think he was showing us it's okay to celebrate with friends and family, to take pleasure in friendship, to laugh, to sing. It's also okay if we choose to fast or abstain, whether for our health or spirituality, but we should not enjoy those who enjoy a celebration. It comes as a surprise to many people to recognize Jesus does not condemn the social customs and traditions of his society. Yes, he condemned injustice, indifference, and cruelty, and called people to store up treasures in heaven rather than on earth, but he did not reject the social norms. He came to the wedding of Cana as a guest, not as a critic. And growing up in that society, he would have known that a family's social status in the community was in part determined by how well they handled a wedding. especially how generously they fed their guest. And nowhere in the gospel does Jesus criticize people for being generous. But now, we come to the critical moment in the story. Mary tells her son they've run out of wine. That simple statement would have sent chills down the spines of the original hearers of the story. They knew that when the wine ran out, the wedding was over. The feasting and dancing and rejoicing and sense of community and bringing families and people together would end too soon. If the wedding ended before the full 7 days, the marriage would have started with bad luck. What was supposed to be a joyous occasion would have turned to embarrassment, possibly recriminations. For the rest of their lives, the couple would be remembered as people whose wedding was a failure. Mary tells her son, the wine has run out. Some commentators have suggested that Mary is actually criticizing Jesus for not bringing wine as a wedding gift as expected. We know how mothers can do this, just real simply point something out. But I don't think that's what Mary was doing. I don't think she was simply telling bad news. I think she was expressing compassion for this family. The interesting thing is she clearly thought Jesus could do something about it. Jesus' reply is often misinterpreted. He calls Mary woman instead of mother. That sounds disrespectful to us, but in Greek it was common. Jesus also tells his mother that his hour has not yet arrived. John doesn't explain this, but it is possible that this statement is foreshadowing what comes later in the gospel. Later on, Jesus will say that his hour has come when he is arrested and crucified. Since this story is at the beginning of the gospel, it seems to me that Mary was gently nudging Jesus to get started on his public ministry, to take the first steps on the journey that will lead to Calvary. Rather than discussing things further, Mary simply tells the servants to listen to Jesus. That's all she says, listen to him. One of those phrases with deep meaning. Throughout the Gospel of John, people are told to listen to Jesus. And to listen is to obey. Now comes the exciting part of the story. 6 large stone jars, each of which had 20 to 30 gallons of water. That's a lot of water. Do the math. 100 to 180 gallons. Often when people refer to Jesus changing water into wine, they picture a glass of wine or a bottle. But the jars, each jar was 20 to 30 gallons. We're told that these were special jars for ritual purification or ablutions. But Jesus is going to do something different with them. And throughout John's gospel, Jesus takes elements of the Old Testament and Jewish tradition and reinterprets them. He's not abolishing the old or committing sacrilege, but transforming something that was good into something better and needed for the moment. Water is good. Water is life. Water cleanses us, refreshes us, renews us, revives us. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells the Samaritan woman at the well that he is the living water. So there's nothing wrong with the water. The servants obey and fill the jars. They don't just fill them, they fill them to the brim. They're overflowing with the water of life, but even what is good will be transformed into something better. Where once there was scarcity and fear and anxiety, there is no wine, now there would be abundance and joy. There would be more wine than the guest could ever drink. An abundance of wine, a fine wine, and where there is abundance, There should be generosity and sharing and rejoicing. There should be celebration and laughter, not just for the few who hoard, but for all to enjoy. For John, the kingdom of God is not something that happens in the distant future. It is something we experience now. The transformation of water into wine is symbolic of the new creation. The transformation of our hearts and souls and minds through the love of Christ. John invites us to join Jesus at the wedding feast, to recognize that there is not scarcity, there is abundance. We are invited to let Jesus transform mundane lives into something beautiful. We are invited to drink the wine of faith and live with heavenly joy. We recently celebrated Holy Communion, and we will celebrate communion throughout the season of Lent on Wednesday nights. Moravians have long recognized that this story of the wedding at Cana is a story of Holy Communion. It is the marriage supper with the Messiah. Now, we Moravians do not expect pastors to perform a miracle at communion, but we can experience the greatest miracle of all. We don't transform wine into something else, but Christ transforms us through love. That where there was a sense of scarcity, of selfishness, of fear and isolation, he transforms into abundance, into grace overflowing, into the wine of divine love, into the sober ecstasy of the city of God. As we say in our ground of the unity, we are redeemed from our isolation. May we rejoice with Christ. And let us now lift our voices together in song with hymn number 449.